Yo, 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 what's poppin', everybody? Thank you for joining episode 13 of Knowledge That Kills. I'm your host, Killshot.
Yep.
Here tonight, got special guest, Mr. Craig Bauer, gonna be joining us. Before we hop into that, let's talk giveaways. What are we giving away? We're giving away one Baby Audio plugin suite tonight. If you want to win, make sure that you're tuned in to the show. Make sure you pay attention. We're gonna have one special question at the end. If you answer correctly, it's your chance to win. We're also going to be giving away this wonderful book, Mix With Your Ears, Not Your Eyes, written by Wes Martin. Wes Martin's one of my teachers, as well as one of my good friends. This is a great resource for anybody interested in ear training. Got scannable QR codes that allow you to identify exactly what frequency sounds like what, as well as a little note-taking section. I'm gonna just go ahead and run y'all a quick commercial for this so you can see what you might be able to win. Let's get it.
Audio engineers mixing for music, podcasts, or film. Never before has there been so many plugins for mixing audio, most of which have hypnotizing graphics that can distract us from what really matters the most. Mix With Your Ears, Not Your Eyes is designed to help you learn to recognize frequencies faster by associating sounds with adjectives while listening to audible examples. These audio examples can be accessed by QR codes that are found in every chapter of the book that instantly take you to the audio example, allowing you to hear what the lesson is, whether film trailers, instruments, mixes, and more. After reading and listening to this interactive book, you will be ready to mix with your ears, not your eyes.
And we're back. Thank y'all very much. With no further ado, let's give a round of applause. Let's welcome our special guest, Craig Bauer. What's poppin', Craig? How you doing today, buddy?
I'm good. We spoke setting this up very early this morning when I was very much still asleep. So I'm a little more awake now than I was this morning.
Awesome, man. Well, hey, first off, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Super dope.
Hey, my pleasure. And by the way, as one of Plug-in Audio's, I'm Plug-in Audio, one of Baby Audio's guys, the mix I was just working on, the last thing I was doing was putting Spaced Out on a lead vocal. That stuff is the bomb, by the
Wow.
way. So anyone that's watching this, if you don't want to win this, we need to have a chat. All right. I'm done. This is not paid promotion, but I am a huge fan of Baby Audio stuff.
Man, me too. I really rock with what they're doing. They're innovating some great tools that are paving the way for the future of us as audio engineers. And let's actually talk about your contribution to that. You've been in this game a long time. You've really achieved some high levels of stuff, as well as
Did you just call me old?
kindly, maybe.
Kindly.
But
Okay.
you run a Instagram page that you give a lot of tips and tricks, as well as helpful hints to whether that's beginners or veterans. Super dope. Why don't you tell us what got you into audio engineering? Did you start as a musician? Was your dad an engineer? Like, how did this come about?
Well, I studied classical piano since second grade. Do I need to tell you how old I am? It's ugly, man. So yeah, I've been a musician pretty much my entire life. I studied classical piano all the way through college. I picked up guitar as a teenager and taught myself how to play guitar. And how did I get into this? I think I was 17. Oddly enough, I had a next door neighbor that was a band member. We were frankly a duo, and we first performed together in sixth grade, and that lasted well past college, up until I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and up until the day that I moved to Chicago. We were still doing gigs. I was probably doing. He ended up being a banker, but we were doing gigs on weekends, and I was doing 10, 12 gigs a week, literally.
Wow.
So to answer the question, when we were, I think, 17, we were actually asked and hired to record a cover of a Simon and Garfunkel tune, oddly enough. No, I'm sorry, it wasn't Simon and Garfunkel. It was most of your viewers are going to be too young to know who this guy is, but his name is Eric Carmen, who oddly enough went to my high school in Cleveland. Eric wrote a couple of huge hits. One of them was covered by Celine Dion, already going probably back a decade, but it was a massively huge hit called All by Myself. Now, oddly enough, he went to my high school and we were asked to record a version of this, having never been in a recording studio in my entire life. And I was probably 17 at the time. And I dragged a Fender Rhodes to this commercial recording studio. It was basically a voiceover place. And they stuck a 87 in front of both of us. And I dragged a Fender Rhodes down there. And I remember putting on headphones. And I remember hearing reverb for the first time. And from that second, it was over. That was it. It was done. I couldn't care less about anything from that moment on. I ended up getting a job washing dishes at a country club and mowing lawns so that I could afford my first 4-track recorder and a little 6-channel mixer. And you can probably go on my Instagram and find that picture of me sitting in front of a little reel-to-reel. It's 1980, I think.
Wow.
It's going back a minute. Digital didn't exist. The internet didn't exist. So yeah, I've been at this a minute. So I moved to Chicago when I was 27. And a few years later, having done nothing but my working with audio at the time studio, I opened what became Hinge Studios in downtown Chicago. And if you don't already know, one of my very first and unknown clients at the time was this dude named Kanye West. And then we spent the next 10, 12 years together.
Wow.
So there you go. How's that?
That's great, man. Wow, that's very cool. You mentioned a couple things I wanted to ask about. Being classically trained on piano, how do you think that contributed to your ability as an engineer? Do you think it gave you an upper hand? Do you think it's important to be a musician in order to be an engineer? What's your feelings?
At the risk of maybe bumming out some viewers, I'm consider myself a mixer that is a musician first. I'm not I can't build you a mic pre. I couldn't tell you what half the parts were. I don't know. I don't care. I approach mixing and producing and mixing from a musician standpoint. I have damn near perfect pitch, to be honest with you, as long as you're asking. Everything that I do and all the success that I've had has all been done based on a music-based approach to audio, more so than a technical one. So, do I think it's important? I know everything about music theory, having studied classical piano my whole life. So, yes, I am a musician first that spent so much time doing this that I probably had no choice but to get good at it.
Wow, that's awesome. And I find a lot of engineers kind of start as a musician and translate into maybe the audio realm. Not everyone, but I think it does help a lot in order to just identify a sound, because if you've never heard a real piano, it's pretty difficult to EQ a piano the right way.
Absolutely. And I get this question asked, frankly, a lot on DMs on Instagram. People asking me how to best ear train and best develop their ear. And I would tell you, frankly, to start studying music theory, to be honest with you, and start understanding what it is that you're listening to, because it can do nothing but help you as far as the musicianship. Again, I approach mixing from a dynamic and musical level, and not of what plugin and what limiter is, and what threshold is best going to yield, the loudest mix. Dynamics are extremely important to me, and building dynamics into a mix. I will spend way more time doing fader rides than figuring out how to compress something 3 different ways so that I don't have to touch the fader. Because developing a mix over the period of 3.5 minutes is all about the ebb and flow and the dynamics of what you're listening to, in my humble opinion.
Wow, that's a very interesting approach, and I like it. I think that's unique. You know, everybody uses the tools a little bit different, but to me, it sounds like you're using compression for more of like tone shaping than volume.
Well, I'm certainly not using compression and limiting in the sense I get so many sessions that are sent to me where you, frankly, you look at how much compression and limiting is being done. And I've had, and I don't know if your viewers know this or you know this, but I also do a little mix consulting thing based off my Instagram. And, people can book me to do that. And they send me mixes and then they share their screen with me. And they basically tell me, well, I try to limit and compress everything so I don't have to do fader rides or the vocal doesn't need to be touched. And I'm like, well, you're kind of taking all the life and the dynamic out of that at the same time. So my approach is, like you just said, it's slightly different. I'm more of a minimalist when it comes to plugins and building a mix. I don't put a single thing into a mix that isn't absolutely required from a plugin standpoint. And hopefully, I'm going to let my work speak for itself at that point.
That's awesome. I respect it. I respect it a lot, man. Um, you mentioned that once you moved to Chicago and opened up your studio, you started working with one particular artist by the name of Kanye West. Um,
I think most people watching here probably know who he is at this point. What do you think?
right. I'm curious. Could you talk to us about some of your work you did with him? I know that you worked on a couple albums. Let's talk specifically Late Registration. I have a couple songs in mind, but is there maybe something you could say about the whole project in general and how that was?
Uh, how it was in general. I mean, I could tell you stories for days about working on that record. And of course, I've spent literally many, many, many years. And a lot of people don't know this, but before he was actually signed and before college dropout, we spent many, many nights, probably for a couple of years, 3 nights a week, where he would bring in his MPC and do a bunch of programming, literally on the spot. And that would get uploaded to an FTP site because even internet sites and WeTransfer and things like that didn't exist at the time. And these tracks would get sent to Diddy, and he would comment on them, and he would make some changes to that, and we'd sit there probably 3 nights a week for a couple of years, starting at 10, 11 o'clock at night and going until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. You have no idea how much time I have spent with this human being. When it came down to Late Registration, uh, if anyone is wildly offended, it's because they're not accurate. So I mixed 8 of those songs. There were actually 4 of us that were mixing pretty much the entire album. So keeping track of who did what became uniquely difficult, given that 4 of us were basically mixing the entire album. I'm fortunate and lucky to say that I think I have the bulk of the record. Heard Him Say was a huge hit. I've got endless stories about. I've got a great story. I got a couple of great stories about working on Heard Him Say. Heard Him Say. And another client that was very well known and had a couple of huge hits right about the same time was Lupe Fiasco, who I think we know. I have a session sitting here from his upcoming album that I can't give you any more details about other than they were gracious enough to allow me to share a screen of an unreleased track. And Lupe was a guest artist on Late Registration. So between those guys, it's kind of interesting because I got pigeonholed very quickly into doing R&B and hip hop based on Lupe and based on Kanye. Also, Chicago was a massively huge gospel town. I didn't grow up religious in any kind of way, but there was another artist in Chicago that came to me and we did a gospel record that very quickly got nominated for a Grammy. And then suddenly I was doing tons and tons of gospel records all over the place. And I can say the same thing about doing smooth jazz records. Chicago had one of the biggest smooth jazz artists in the world, did a bunch of records for him. And suddenly at the same time, I'm doing smooth jazz, gospel, and hip hop pretty much every week for many, many, many years.
Wow. Talk to us. That seems like a lot to juggle. and although I'm sure it is, what keeps you accurate to properly representing each genre as a mix? Because I'm sure you can relate. A lot of the rap hip hop mixers mix everything with the bass loud as fuck, kick drums loud as fuck. And if you were to apply
Well,
that to gospel or jazz, that
if you
obviously.
want to do anything other than, one genre, you probably have to figure out how to appropriately handle all of these things. And if you go back to the early 2000s, and when Hinge was really just getting going in the first 5 or so years, clients would be sitting literally right next to you when you're pushing up the very first fader. So it's not like it is now, frankly, nearly 29 years later, where I wouldn't let a client anywhere near this room until they've heard the first pass. That's just not going to happen. Uh, and there's no need for it to happen, to be honest with you. But at the very beginning, it was a very different time, and I was, a young dude and kind of coming up. And these clients would be sitting right next to you, so you kind of learn these genres literally on the spot as you were doing them. So if you had this idea that you're going to turn the bass up 6 dB louder than it should be for a jazz tune, the guy sitting right next to you is going to check you pretty quick. So, uh, and I have a very wide range of interest as far as music goes. Given the fact of those genres that I have the most notable records in as far as my career goes, I grew up listening to singer songwriter stuff and pop. So what I personally gravitate to has nothing to do with the stuff I actually have a name in. So
Wow.
again, go figure. I'm a kind of a singer songwritery pop guy. I grew up. How many of your listeners aren't even going to know who James Taylor is? But that was, and he's still going, but that was the pinnacle of what I was listening to back in the 1980s and 90s.
Wow. Um, that's very interesting. And you mentioned you're a pop guy. There's one record in particular you mixed. It was for Saturday Night Live. The title is Mother Lover by Justin Timberlake. Could you talk to us about what it was like to not only mix that song, but what it's like to mix for a Saturday Night Live broadcast? That's huge.
Well, that's a funny story too. That came about because if you go back, and you probably find videos on YouTube from this, when American Idol kind of got huge back in, was this the 2000s?
Yep.
Right when that came out, Oprah decided that she was going to run her own version of American Idol on the Oprah show. And Harlow and Sony Studios, Sony Records, and they sent a guy from Sony who was a top A&R guy to Chicago, who spent basically, I don't know, 6 weeks, 2 months, basically working on this Oprah thing, and it was all done completely and totally out of my studio. So all the recording, all the rehearsals, all the background stuff, and I became extremely good friends with this guy, who actually I'm still in contact with and still working. In fact, we're starting a project this week, and we're going now 15 years, 20 years. He ultimately became Justin's manager. And I got a call from him who said, "Hey, I've got this thing that we need to do. I'm sending it to you, or I'm going to have him send it to you, or the guy that was working on the track." I'd never seen Dick in a Box on SNL. It wasn't even familiar to me. And they ended up sending me the producers, these guys called the Lonely Island. It's a couple of guys who actually have a name as producers. Without knowing anything about this, without the video, they sent me a Pro Tools session, and I knew it was Justin. And I'm listening to this thing going, what in God's name is this? I mean, I was just like dumbfounded listening, because I didn't have the video. I had no idea what it was for. I wasn't even told initially it was for SNL. I got the session on late Saturday morning, and SNL tapes at like 5 o'clock in New York. So I only had a few hours to do this. And it wasn't till it aired that night that I actually found out what the hell this thing was. and then it's sort of lived in infamy ever since.
Wow. That's amazing, man. I
The long roundabout story. I'm probably putting in a bunch of run-on sentences, but go ahead.
I just watched it on YouTube actually, and I love like the tone of Justin's voice over like the almost 80s style up tempo beat. You did a very good job with like giving it a lot of low end and a lot of like space for the vocals. Could you maybe tell us what your theory behind that is, or a technique you use to create that?
Well, now you're asking me to think about what I did on a track from 15 years ago. Uh, um, honestly, I don't couldn't possibly. I think that was done on a Euphonics mixing console as well, so it's not strictly a in the box mix, and there was probably a bunch of outboard gear. And because yeah, I honestly probably don't remember exactly, but is there anything more important than a pop song other than the vocal? Rhetorically speaking, I'm going to say I don't think so. So making the vocal stand out in any mix, in any pop mix, or probably pretty much any mix, period, short of grunge, indie rock, or especially in pop, there's nothing more important than the vocal. And Justin's voice is obviously so unbelievably identifiable that I don't think it was difficult to make that a primary feature of that track.
Awesome. I mean, I think that's a gem in itself, you know, just like making sure that you treat the genre as appropriate with whatever you're doing, because I'm sure a pop vocal needs to be 1 or 2 dB louder than a rap vocal. I would even argue most rappers like their vocals under the beat a little bit.
Could be, could be. Definitely pop is, it's I'd like to pride myself in the fact that I think my mixes, or I try to make my mixes very dimensional and wide, and you know, but ultimately the vocal has to be right here. At, at the end of the day, it's about the vocal in a pop tune.
Amazing. Um, we have one more artist I'd like to talk about. You mentioned him earlier. You did some work with him on Late Registration. Lupe Fiasco. I know you've done a few songs for him. You also currently kind of work for him. Walk us through like uh what it's like working on um his vocals. Maybe we're gonna hop
Well, if
into
you
the
go back
session.
to his first three records, which I did his first three records. His big first hit was Kick Push, and here's what you're gonna love about this track. That track consisted of one stereo stem and his vocal, and absolutely there might be a couple kick layers or drum samples layers in there, but short of that, that is literally just a stereo stem and his vocal, and I recorded all those vocals as well. So back in the day, my studio was really as much a tracking studio as it is as I was a mixer. I've sort of graduated from that and kind of left the tracking world behind and leave that for other people. But I've recorded both Kanye and Lupe so many times I probably can't imagine. That vocal was probably done with a very high end mic. I'm not a huge fan of dynamic mics, and anyone who follows me on Instagram has probably seen me dog SM7 endlessly. uh, all those vocals were recorded with, you could probably find a picture of Lupe sitting in front of a vintage C12, or it might be a 251. But I had a very extravagant mic collection back then, and I believed in using high end mics even for hip hop.
Wow. I I personally love the 251. That's one of my favorite mics. I've also
If you don't like a 251, especially a really good solid vintage one, if you and chances are they're so rare these days that hearing one live and hearing one for real, it's an experience that everyone should really have at some point or another, because there's just nothing like a vintage 251 or a vintage C12. from way back then. That's actually kept up and taken care of and in really good working condition. It is a religious experience.
No
And I
doubt.
can tell you that, so my typical recording chain for even hip hop would have been a high-end vintage mic going through a GML 82 EQ and a GML 8900 compressor. They're not really made anymore. There's a bunch of plugins that emulate, especially the GML. Very high-end stuff, very expensive stuff back in the day. And all of those vocals for all these artists that we're talking about were all done through that chain that I just told you.
Wow, that is spectacular, and thank you for sharing that. You know, that's one of my main things is getting a great sound on. I think that that's so much slept on that what you start with.
I talk about this endlessly. I don't care how good of a mixer you are, you aren't. You cannot take a horribly recorded track and turn it into an amazing mix. It's just not possible. You can take a good track and turn it into a really good mix, but if something's recorded well, that's when the magic happens on the mix side. You absolutely have to have well recorded tracks or you're completely wasting your time and spinning your wheels. And in this day and age with home recording and inexpensive microphones and inexpensive mic pre's, and I'm not going to mention any particular names, and inexpensive converters, the reality is that the recording level of tracks in this current period of time compared to 10 and 15 years ago, it's just nothing alike. Absolutely nothing alike, unfortunately.
Wow. I would love to hop over into the Lupe session. I know we've been talking about it for a minute. Are you ready to hop into that?
Sure, we can do that.
Awesome. If you're in the audience right now, now's the time to pay attention. Take your notes because you about to get the sauce. In 3, 2, 1. Boom, we're here.
Yeah. So what you are looking at, I chose a song. Huge production and it's not overly complicated. And if I just sort of scroll down the edit window here, this is a finished final mix that is completely and totally done. The entire album is done. The thing that you're going to notice probably right away is how unbelievable, this is the actual mix session, how unbelievably few plugins are actually used on this. And in any of my mixes, because as I said, I don't put a single thing in a mix that doesn't have an absolute and obvious benefit. Having 7 plugins on every single track, and then anyone who follows me on Instagram is probably familiar with my feeling about using food group auxes or subgroup auxes and taking all your drums and routing them to an aux, and then having a ton of plugins on all the individual tracks and then a ton of plugins on your subgroup. I talk endlessly about that scenario, and I can talk about that briefly here as well. But as you scroll through this, and we're looking at a tape plugin that is parallel compression on the bass at the moment from Baby Audio. I am not a subgroup guy. I don't use subgroups. I'm very, very big in using VCAs as far as my gain structure. We can scroll all the way down to the bottom here. And now you're looking at VCAs of my session. And so basically I create food group VCAs as opposed to using auxes and subgroups in that way. So all of my gain structure is really based on VCAs and then routing all of the individual audio tracks to the master fader and not through subgroups. I'm very big on using parallel processing and parallel compression. And here's a perfect example. This particular track, the drum tracks are basically a stereo loop. And I'm using parallel compression on the drum track here. So you can see a send right there being routed to this aux, where I absolutely love. This is my favorite parallel processor for compression on drums. It's not even a new plugin, but every time I try to find something that beats it, this wins every single time. It's a Massey CT5. And on drums, it's typically a slow attack and fast release. And of course, we're not sharing any audio here, but parallel compression on a kick drum. And that's another interesting thing that I think I could talk about really briefly. Although this is just a stereo mix of the drums, I parallel process with compression. Let's talk about a program track like a hip hop track or an R&B track, or, as opposed to live drums for the moment. I use parallel compression independently on kicks and independently on snares and independently on toms, as opposed to routing all of the drums, kicks, snares, and toms and other elements to one aux where that's being where parallel compression is being applied to that. And a lot of people go, well, that's a whole lot of aux returns and a whole lot of separate plugins for parallel compression. The reason I do that is because I don't want the overlap of snares and kicks to interfere with the attack and release of what's happening with this parallel compression. So I'm basically considering it part of the kick drum sound. If I'm putting parallel compression on a kick, and then the parallel is by itself with only the kick, and that's basically part of the sound. And the difference of what happens when you do that without other elements potentially interrupting the attack and release of that kick drum, you always get this nice solid attack and the solid release, and it never changes. And a lot of people ask me, well, what's the difference between using parallel compression as opposed to sticking in a compressor on the kick track itself and then using the wet dry balance to sort of control how that's happening? And I would tell you there's a bunch of reasons why I do that. And there's a huge benefit to, I think, the way that I'm doing it. One is when you use the balance control on a compressor on the track itself, I think you tend to set it and forget it and never think about it again, because you're not staring at that fader, you're not staring at that track, and you get it on there, and then because it's never really presented to you in any way ever again, unless you specifically go to look at it, that balance is sitting there and you never really think about it ever again, for better or worse. If it's great, wonderful. If it needs some attention after you've built the track and it's not quite hitting the same way, tend not to think about it a whole lot when you're using the wet dry balance on the track itself. The other thing I like to consider with parallel compression is the difference between parallel compression. I consider parallel to be additive in that your direct always is this level, then you're sending post fader to a compressor and then blending that in. It's never changing the balance in the mix of these two things. That's always there. This always gets blended in. So I consider parallel to be additive as opposed to subtractive when you're using the wet dry balance. So very big on the parallel side. Of course, one thing that you have to be leery of when doing parallels, you got to make sure that your delay compensation is working correctly, so you don't end up with phase problems. So if you're working on a good rig and you've got the proper delay compensation, you don't necessarily have to worry about phase cancellation or latency or delay or any of those potential problems that come up with parallel processing. And here's a good example of on the bass track here. And as you're sitting here staring at how unbelievably few plugins are going into this mix and going, well, it couldn't possibly sound good. Well, you'll be the judge of that when it comes up. But I basically have my sort of set of tools that I use and I like to think of the main set of plugins that I use almost as it is a hardware situation, in that I'm not going to constantly swap out EQs and go use a different EQ and a different plugin on every single track just because I don't want to use the same EQ or I want to constantly experiment. My main set of tools are the same tools I use in every single mix. I have my main EQ, which happens to be Equilibrium from DMG Audio. There are a handful of other EQs that have a flavor, if it's a Neve thing or it has a certain high end or a plug-in lines like a mag, which goes up to 40K on the high end. I have certain other tools that I use to get a sound when I need it, but my main set of tools are always going to basically be the same from every single mix because I know them intimately. I don't have to wonder if changing from this EQ and going, well, I want to see what this does, and not knowing it really well. I'm a firm believer in having a set of tools that you know intimately backwards and forwards, and then having flavors for character and other tools that you use to add certain characteristics that maybe your main set of tools don't incorporate is basically how my entire philosophy of mixing goes. One of the things I like to do on bass, instead of compressing the actual bass track, is using a parallel. I often will use this saturation plugin on the parallel side of a bass. And when you think about it, what is saturation doing? Well, saturation is basically squaring off the top of the waveform. And when you start squaring off the top of the waveform there, it's essentially almost acting like a compressor because it's not letting peaks through. So, yeah, and what I tend to do with bass in parallel is, in this scenario, I'm using a tape plugin to do this. Often I'm using literally saturation, a plugin like Decapitator or Black Box, and I'm dealing with the EQ on the bass track itself. If it's a hip hop track, as inevitably you've noticed, and probably lots of people have noticed, when you get an 808 bass track, the inconsistency of the low end and volume from note to note when you're dealing with an 808 bass often can't be handled with a compressor anyway. There are some plugins that theoretically automatically deal with gain structure based on a note. I've never had amazing success short of going in on an 808 bass and often manually EQing and compressing or using clip gain on a, let's say it's a hip hop track and you essentially have only 5 or 6 notes to begin with, going identifying and making selections and editing on a per note basis and creating a preset for your clip effects and EQing an 808 bass track based on the note and level on a track like that. I literally just posted something about this on my Instagrams like a few days ago. I love using saturation in parallel, and that saturation tends to control the upper mids and high end that might speak, and so you can get a bass to speak properly. Have plenty of low end, deal with the low end, and that saturation, that squared off waveform, tends to help equalize. I don't mean from an EQ standpoint. Get consistency on upper mids and the high end of a bass track. So that's why I love using saturation because it acts like a compressor and deals with consistency in upper mids at the same time.
Wow,
So,
that's very very cool. There's a new plugin that just is called Noctonal. This producer engineer DJ Swivel makes it. Have you heard of that?
I have not heard of that.
I think you should check it out because it's essentially like an EQ that tunes based on harmonics. So you could put it on an 808 and it's gonna automatically pick the overtones and like harmonics above whatever your root note is. Like allows you to turn kicks into 808s and do a bunch of cool shit. But I think you'd really like it.
I'll have to check that out.
I'm curious.
What's it called again?
It's called Noctonal.
All right. Well, definitely.
I see this EQ.
So here, I'm gonna scroll down here on this session.
Okay,
So
cool.
I also, just from an organizational standpoint, I always color code my tracks in groups, except for vocals, and I'll explain that in a second. So drums in my sessions, you can open up any Pro Tools session in the past probably decade, and you're going to see the drums are always blue, the bass is always green, keyboards are generally always red, guitars are always light blue, lead vocal is always yellow, and then background vocals based on part tend to change colors here and there. But I'm going to scroll down. This particular track that I'm looking at right here is actually a vocal sample. And here's a perfect example of where I have my main EQ but I need this thing to speak in a way that this particular EQ isn't going to add the flavor I want, especially on the upper mid. So I'm grabbing this plugin Alliance. Basically, it's a Neve channel. And what this high end does on this plugin alone is wildly identifiable. And whenever I need that high end to speak in a certain way, I instantly go to this plugin. And the only thing I have to touch is how much high end I'm adding at 10 or 12K. And 1 or 2 clicks on that knob makes all of the difference in the world. So again, picking flavors when choosing flavors when you need them, and knowing the plugins well, and using a set of tools and finding alternatives for character, I think is the route to consistency in one's mixes. Which will bring me to my next conversation, as long as we're going there. I'm actually, so the most plugins you're going to see on any track and in any of my sessions is going to be on the vocal. I tend to EQ. I'm using a very old school plugin from Waves. This plugin, I can't even tell you how old it is. Arvox. I mean, it's going back a very long time, but there is something about this plugin when you stick it on a vocal, especially in hip hop, that I tend to use 2 compressors on vocal tracks. And if it's not Arvox, it's typically 2 different compressors with small, low ratios, as opposed to trying to slam the crap out of 1. I will sooner use 2 with a low ratio and just do a little bit of compression on each. And I tend to do, if there's de-essing that's required, that de-essing is going to go between the 2 compressors. So here's the perfect example of, here's Lou's vocal, his main vocal. Got a fair amount of EQ. I'm going to let you know that his vocal was actually recorded at home due to by himself because of the current world situation with COVID. So this vocal was actually tracked at home. It required a little bit more EQ. I would call this record kind of a high-tech mix of a purposely lo-fi track, and as a lot of hip hop would be. So here you got a EQ on the vocal, then I'm using Arvox, then I'm de-essing, and then I'm putting a compressor, as you can see over here, just a very small amount of additional compression after all the rest of the processing has taken place. And then the other thing I'm doing on all of his lead vocals, and then sending in parallel to a tape plugin. So that's where some glue is happening in parallel on top of the little bit of compression that's happening on the vocal itself. They're all being sent, all of his lead vocals and ad-libs are then being sent to a tape plugin for that glue and for adding a little bit of that analog sound to this thing. And like I said, you're going to find more plugins in any of my sessions based on vocals more than anything else. Here's a brand new plugin that we've talked about and probably people have seen. Eventide just came out with a brand new plugin called Split EQ. I'm basically doing a little more, doing some additional upper mid control, more on the transient, which probably has more to do with sibilants and S's than anything else. And here's another vocal track. This is a sample, and it's got the typical plugins I talked about, and then I'm doing a little saturation in between all of that. And so when I'm using 2 compressors, which is often on a vocal, a little bit in front, then a little bit of the processing that needs to happen, whether it's dynamic EQ or some saturation or de-essing, then I finish it off generally with a little bit more compression. And it's not, one of the things that you would think is that based on genre, it's going to be wildly different. And I would tell you that's the difference is built into the production more so than it is built into the mix. And I tend to use the same kind of tools and use them the same way and still get the proper result based on the genre. So scrolling down here, the other thing we're scrolling now past food group VCAs. And as you notice, there's absolutely no food group auxes in this thing. It's just not my route. And then we'll scroll down to my master fader. Of course, I've taken the title out of this thing, and since we're not sharing that information at this point, here's another interesting thing I do that maybe you guys will find interesting. I'm a user of a control surface. I have an Avid S6 in front of me with 32 faders. I'm very much a hands-on guy when it comes to writing vocals and doing rides and creating dynamics, more so than slamming the crap out of something with compressors, as I mentioned earlier. One of the things I'm extremely big on as far as gain structure is never allowing an over to hit the stereo bus or master fader, and never allowing an over to leave the stereo bus. And I don't mean I don't even mean hitting 0.0. I don't let it happen going in, and I don't let it happen going out, period. And all these VCAs are part of the gain structure to control overall level. Then the last thing I'm going to say about that is I never have tools on my master fader. Nothing gets added, nothing gets deleted. My mix template consists of two things: VCAs and a master fader, and absolutely nothing else. Everything else gets built into a mix from the get-go. There's no standard sort of thing that happens other than those VCAs, and I never ever change the plugins that are going on my mix bus or my master fader. And the reason is I kind of feel that if you're constantly changing and adding and putting things on your mix bus from mix to mix to mix to mix, that it becomes trickier and much more difficult, especially for younger and newer guys that are trying to learn this craft, to get consistent results when you're constantly changing what's happening on your mix bus and your master fader. This way, and if I need something to happen, if I felt the need to put saturation or distortion or some sort of tape plugin or anything of that sort on the master fader, I would first ask myself, well, what things in the mix am I trying to affect with that? Is it really the overall mix that I want completely inside saturation, or are there elements within that mix that I'm really actually wanting to have speak that way? So instead of, if I felt like, well, I want this to hit a certain way and I want some sort of saturation, I'm sooner going to ask myself what elements within the mix are really calling for that, as opposed to slapping on the master fader. Because for as many things it may do good for, there's probably potentially as many things it's negatively affecting as opposed to positively affecting. That's often the case. So, like I said, I will much sooner go in and find elements as opposed to start adding and changing and completely redesigning my master fader or mix bus on a mix to mix level.
Very interesting. I love the approach.
If I opened up, I don't care, you can name any session from the last, I don't know how many years, and you're going to see the same exact set of plugins on my master fader. Oh, and what I started this conversation with is with my S6. Let's say you're doing a mix and, keeping track of your gain structure and making sure you're not hitting overs and slamming the crap out of the mix bus, and potentially what you don't hear is distortion. If you hit an over during the mix, could potentially become distortion by the time it gets to mastering and after it's mastered. So what you're not hearing on the mix side may or may not become an issue if a bunch of level and limiting is getting added in the mastering phase of this. So that's the reason why I don't allow for overs ever to hit the mix bus, and I don't allow them to leave. So my very first plugin on my master fader, oddly enough, is a VU meter. And you go, well, why? There's a meter in Pro Tools. Of course there is. The difference being is that I have a small little monitor in front of me that sits 100% of the time, and the only thing on it are my mix bus plugins, which means that if I were to hit a master, and with this VU meter as my first insert on my master fader, I know always if I hit an over going into my mix bus, and this has no sonic imprint on the mix whatsoever, it doesn't have a sound. It's literally a meter, and it sits directly in front of me. So if I were to hit an over, and I don't care if it's 0.1 or 7 dB over, I'm going to know instantly because a big red light is going to stare me in the face the second it happens, which means I don't have to scroll down into Pro Tools and look at the master fader meter, see a red overlight and go, well, I wonder when that happened. And I also keep as my last insert Isotopes Insight, which is basically knowing, making sure that I'm not hitting any overs going out and knowing what my LUFS is always. And these plugins, and it's VU meter, EQ, compressor, limiter, and LUFS meter. Never changes. I always know exactly what's going on in my mix 100% of the time. I don't ever have to wonder. I don't ever have to do anything other than look up to see what's happening. And especially for younger guys, understanding gain structure, understanding what's happening going into your mix bus, and how that overall level coming in is going to affect what's happening on your mix bus, obviously, and making sure that you're keeping track of your gain structure, I think is an invaluable tool. And one of the very first things that as a newer or younger guy, you're going to want to get a hold of and get a really good grasp of is the overall gain structure of a mix.
Super important, man. I'm curious. You mentioned you use Insight too, and you pay attention to your LUFS. Do you maybe have a target loudness that you're aiming for? Is there too loud of a LUFS for you? How does that work?
So yes, I have a target that I like to keep, and it's probably generally in the -10 to -12, ideally. That means I don't have to slam the living crap out of the mix. I don't have to slam the living crap out of a limiter on the mix side. The issue being is that how many times I get rough mixes that are -8, -7, -6, insanely, ridiculously, stupidly hot to the point of absolute ridiculousness. So the issue there is that, as we all know, anything that's louder tends to fool us into thinking that it sounds better. So you could take a mix that's, let's say it's 6 dB louder than the final mix. And that rough mix can have absolutely no thought into it whatsoever. It can honestly be utterly horrible, distorted, out of balance. But if you compare something 6 dB louder to something that sonically may sound way better, the louder thing tends to fool people into thinking it sounds better. When if you were to take that rough mix and turn that rough mix down to the mix level, it would be wildly obvious, unbelievably quickly, that the rough mix sounds absolutely god awful and the mix is blowing it away. But louder tends to make us think that things are better. So to answer your question of what my target is, it often depends on who the client is and how well I know the client and whether or not they've sent me a mix that's insanely loud and whether or not I can tell them that, hey, man, your rough is ridiculously loud and obnoxious. You need to stop listening to that. You need to throw it away. And if you dare want to compare a rough mix to a final mix, you got to be damn sure that you're going to turn your rough mix down to meet the level of the mix and then tell me which one sounds better. The problem is you can't say that to every single client, and that becomes a communication thing and the relationship that you have with the client. Because you certainly don't want to tell a client that you don't know very well that the rough mix sounds like shit and they need to turn it down 6 dB. So we're getting into the politics of mixing as much as we are as the technical side of mixing. So my overall level has a little bit to do with who the client is, how well I know the client, how good the rough is, what I need to pay attention to, if anything, about the rough mix, and making sure that I'm not shooting myself in the foot by delivering a final mix that's 6 dB softer than their -6 LUFS, god awful, horrible rough mix that's distorting everywhere. So we're dealing with a little bit of politics, but the ultimate answer to the question is -10, -9, in that range. It's been slowly creeping up volume wise over the past bit of time for all the reasons that I just explained. I've also had this conversation. I sure am talking a lot, aren't I? Had this conversation a lot with various mastering guys. My compression and my limiting is built into the mix from the very get go. It's not something I add later on in the mix. It's literally there from the get go, and I'm not smacking the crap out of compressors and limiters. A couple dB on the compression side. There's a couple different limiters that I use depending on the track, and I audition. They're built into my template. I'm a fan of Ozone Maximizer. I'm a fan of Program Alliance True Peak as a final limiter, but you're not, if I were to play the mix and you were to look at the actual limiting and the metering on the limiting, you're not seeing this. You're going to see tiny little blips. Subsequently, that limiting and that compression is built into the mix, and the final mix that gets delivered to the client and to mastering, there's only one version. I'm not creating a version with limiting so that I can send a crazy loud mix that has absolutely nothing to do with what the final mix actually sounds like. Because if you're doing that, you're completely altering the sound of your mix. And subsequently, what you're printing as a final mix, which may go to mastering, may have absolutely nothing to do with the thing that you just sent your client that's limited to the nines. So I don't like adding things to send to clients for listening to a mix, and I don't like taking them away either. If I were to bypass the processing, the compression, or certainly the limiting that's happening that I build into the mix would fall apart because it's been built with it in there. So what I send to mastering, what I send to the client is one and the same. A number of mastering guys have said to me they would much rather get a mix that is all that is built in and it's sitting at -10 or -9 or even -8, as opposed to taking that limiting off. And now you're delivering something that could be anywhere from 5, 6, and 7 dB softer and has absolutely nothing to do with what you've just sent the client and gotten approved by your client. Now they've got to figure out, how am I going to make up 6 and 7 and 8 dB of gain, and the possibility and potential variation of what they do to get that that 6 to 8 dB of gain compared to what you've sent your client could be so wildly different. These two things have nothing to do with each other. So my personal philosophy is to build that into the mix, deliver that to mastering. It just means that the mastering engineer doesn't have to invent ways to find 6 and 7 and 8 dB of gain. They can focus on fine movements in the mastering and subtle or minor amounts of improvements, as opposed to reinventing your mix from scratch, essentially. That is my personal philosophy, and a lot of mastering guys have agreed with that philosophy and don't want to be responsible for finding 8 dB of gain in a mix after you removed a limiter.
Right. Man, you're dropping all the gems on us, Greg.
I've been screaming this stuff on my Instagram for quite some time now.
Well,
and I know a lot of guys will limit them. You know, they'll do their mix. They'll stick a limiter on there so they can send something crazy loud to a client, and then they remove that and send that to mastering. To me, that just runs too much risk of too much variation between what the client is listening to and ultimately what the master is going to sound like. And I'm going to say one more thing about this. I find it interesting, and I'm potentially about to offend some people, so I apologize in advance. I find it interesting of guys who call themselves mixing and mastering engineers at the same time. I mix and master my record. I don't master my own records. I deliver it, like I said, I've already delivered something there's only one version of it. But when you think about what mastering guys do, it's not just level. Theoretically, they're making subtle EQ improvements and finding the last few percent of improvement to your mix, right? Ideally, that's how why mastering was created in the first place. The next and final stage of improving the sonics of this record, not just making it louder. Um, the thing that I find interesting is guys that master their own mixes. At what point do they change their hat? So you spend a day working on a mix, you get at a certain place, you're going, and you got your mix hat on, and you go, man, I'm this mix is great. I'm really loving where this is. I love this. I'm gonna send it to the client. Client's gonna approve that, and then you go, well, before I send it to my client, I'm gonna master this. So you take your mix head off after you just said, I'm really happy with this mix, and go, okay, what's wrong with this mix? I'm mastering now. It's a, I don't quite get personally where one switches their hat and saying, okay, here's a mix that's done, and now I'm going to go find what's wrong with this mix and master it. Why wouldn't you just fix it in the mix side? If there's an EQ problem, aren't you fixing it on the mix side, not the mastering side?
Have a very good point there, Craig. Hey.
So I don't know who I just offended, but I also believe in getting a trusted and solid set of ears as a mastering guy. There's obviously many very well-known, very great mastering engineers in the world that I never would hesitate to have them listen to a mix that I'm proud of and saying, you know what, we've got a hair too much low mid. Let's pull out a 0.7 dB of 200 just to take some excess low mids out. And trusted ears. I think there's value to that.
Most definitely. I mention very often that music is a collaborative process. It's never been made by one. The fact that you can have a team of mix engineers, mastering it, even producers, because really a great mix starts with a great production.
Clearly.
But just one step to the next and being able to rely on the next phase to add that improvement is what really determines a good record from a great record, in my opinion. And
no, I completely and totally agree.
We have been having some questions roll in. I was curious, do you want to give us one final scroll through of the session? Maybe drop one more little gem for us?
I've hit all the big points, but let's see if there's anything else. I have one last thing that we can talk about is from the mix standpoint, and that is whether or not you're putting effects plugins directly on the track and using wet dry balance, or using aux sends and sending let's say you want to put a reverb on a vocal. This session, I happen to do instances of both, where some of the tracks, or most often, I'm using an aux send to get reverb or delay on a vocal, and in certain instances, and that happens to happen in a place or two on this particular mix, where I'm inserting the reverb directly onto the track, and you go, well, what makes that decision? And that's kind of the one other area that I think we can talk about something useful here, slightly out of order, having just talked about master fader and mixing, or master fader and mastering. Let me see if I can find a track where that is the case. I'm pretty sure there is one. Here's a track here that's actually a track of Lupe that's got recorded specifically and was printed and sent to me, that has some distortion and kind of sounds like a grimy old radio thing with some distortion, and it's pretty aggressive actually. And in this case, the point I'm trying to make is that here I have a reverb plugin directly on the track, as opposed to using an aux send and return to add reverb to the track. And what makes the distinction for me, and when I do one or the other, is when I add reverb directly on a track and use the wet dry balance, you get kind of a pretty different flavor of that track sitting inside reverb, as opposed to adding reverb on top and adding a space around a dry vocal. It's a very different flavor and a very different sound to have a vocal sitting inside a reverb, and how much reverb that generates and the feeling that sort of gives is very different. And I think I see a lot of sessions that come in with younger producers, even if they're really talented, where the idea of using an aux send for reverb is wildly foreign, which is, when you go back to analog mixing consoles from the day, there was no such thing as sticking a plate reverb directly on a audio track on a tape machine. That world didn't exist. So this is sort of the way that the world of mixing came about, using aux sends and returns. It gets you a very different flavor than taking a reverb plugin and applying it directly to a vocal and using the wet dry balance. So I think that's my last piece of thing to throw on about this particular track.
Do you mind showing us your reverb plugin real quick?
If people aren't using this guy, you better get it quick, because it's one of the best ones out there.
Absolutely.
So look at how much is blended in here. A whopping 11% on this track. But if I were to play it for you, the difference that would happen if I were to put that on an aux track and have the balance 100% on the return and push up the send, would yield a very different flavor than what it's doing here.
Most definitely. Wow. Definitely dropping the gems. Let's go ahead and hop over into the Q&A. Did you want to give us a quick tour of your room?
It's gonna sort of jump the camera around a little bit real quick. So this is my brand new Northward Acoustics room. It's a whopping couple weeks old here. It was finished literally on Thanksgiving Day. And then that Friday morning, unfortunately, I woke up with a horrible cold that has lasted for 2.5 weeks. So even though it's been done since Thanksgiving, I'm only on my third mix in here because I couldn't work for about almost 2 weeks.
Wow.
So yeah, a real bummer to have spent 14 months designing and building a room and not being able to use it for 2 weeks after it's finished. It's unbelievable. If you want to hop over to Instagram and follow Northward Acoustics, I'm sure lots of your viewers are already familiar with who Thomas is and his rooms. Sterling Mastering, he literally builds this room all over the world. He posted a picture of the speaker box that gets put into these walls that are mounted on springs, and the resonant frequency in this room is flat, damn near down to 8 hertz. It's just unbelievable.
Wow.
I'm extremely proud of it. It sounds absolutely incredible. I was in a Northward room when I was in LA for 5 years, renting a room at Dave Collins Mastering. And problem is once you've heard a room like this and once you've worked in the room like this, you have no choice but to always work in this room. There is no going back. So after 8 years in LA, I ended up moving to Denver, and there was no not working in this room. So I ended up building one myself. There's no tracking space. I literally only mix. I'm going to pick up this stand here and give you the quick run through here. There's the door that enters, and we're looking at the back of the room. As we scroll around here, I'm going to go the other way now so I don't tangle myself up. And here's the front of the room and my ATC 110s. And
yeah.
there's the quick 360.
Super dope. Super dope. Looks like we're about ready for this Q&A. You ready to hop on over there?
Hey man, you're gonna have to read them to me because the screen's too far away to see them. So
Perfect.
Sure, go for it.
Boom. Here we are. I'm gonna go ahead and scroll back a little bit. Now would be the appropriate time to ask questions for the audience. Somebody asked, why are all of your tracks touch mode?
Because I do tons as I said, literally from the very beginning, building a mix is not about how many compressors and limiters I can use so that I don't have to do fader rides. That's not mixing to me. So my basic workflow is get sounds in all the tracks, and then I spend a very significant amount of time with my hands on faders working the mix so that literally when I touch the fader, it jumps into automation. I typically am in touch trim, to be honest with you, so that I'm adding or subtracting moves most of the time. So touch mode is just all about doing rides and being spontaneous and building dynamics into a mix and making mixes interesting using faders. So that's why they sit there in touch mode, because by the time I don't put it into right mode or touch mode until I'm literally have gotten sounds on the entire track. Generally speaking, it's not often that I'm going to put the tracks into automation until there's a really good solid foundation to start, working the mix. But once I do, the session lives in touch and lives in trim. I don't use latch because if you're not familiar, touch means is that as soon as I touch a fader here on the console, it goes into write mode. As soon as I let go of the fader, it stops writing. If you're in latch mode, it means that as soon as you touch the fader, it stays in automation. Even if you take your hand off the fader, it sits there and stays in automation. So as I'm working the mix and as I'm doing rides, it's only in automation literally when I'm touching the fader.
Wow.
I think that should answer the question. Yes? No?
Yes, indeed. Johnson3224 asks, what's the hardest thing about mixing?
Getting good at it.
Yep, I'll second that one.
What is the hardest thing about mixing? Does he have a specific sort of? I honestly, I think it's learning not to overdo things, not to do too much processing, not to do things that aren't necessary. I tend to find that if you add plugin on top of plugin on top of a plugin on top of a plugin, and then send that to an aux, and then do a plugin on top of a plugin on a plugin, that tends to make mixes small, narrow, less deep, less dimension. So I think the thing that is most interesting and of most value to guys coming up is learning not to apply processing. Well, it goes back to the book that you talked about at the beginning. Stop mixing with your eyes and only mix with your ears. And therefore, if you do that and you stop looking at empty inserts on your tracks, you're only going to add what you need, because you're not looking at empty inserts going, well, I must not be doing something, so I better add another plugin.
Yes. That's the gems, Craig. Let's see. Anthony Lords asks, would it make sense to send both mixes to a mastering engineer? One with a limiter on the master bus and one without, kind of like a reference track?
Not for me, man. My mix is my mix, and when it's done, that is the mix. Taking the limiter off will make the mix completely and utterly and totally fall apart. So my answer to that question for me is absolutely not. It's all built in from the top down, and there's absolutely no reason to remove that limiter, because the mix will not be the same and it completely falls apart. I know there's lots of guys that do that. Personally agree with it. And I know that fine gentleman is an Instagram follower, by the way. So, hey, thanks for tuning in.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for tuning in for sure. One Shot Mac asks us, I see that you're shelving the EQ on the mud frequencies of your vocals. Is there a better benefit by doing that rather than just using a bell to cut it?
You broke up a little bit there, so you'll have to repeat that one.
Oh, I'm sorry. It says, I see that you're shelving the EQ on the mud frequencies of the vocal. Is there a better benefit to doing that rather than just using a bell dip?
I do what's necessary for the vocal at the time. There is no rule. If I'm doing what he's describing, it's because it sounds better that way. And in fact, a lot of these tracks, and let me pull up another one of the vocal, it probably has a high pass filter and some low. This one doesn't, but I thought I saw one that did. Take this one. We're rolling off lows and pulling out shelf. So obviously that vocal needs it.
Awesome.
Whatever's necessary is what we do, and nothing more, nothing less.
Fish Jackson asks, how much do you love the black box?
It's one of my go-to 2 saturation plugins. Decapitator and Black Box are my 2 go-tos. They have very different flavors, and again, when you really know your tools and you really know what one sounds like compared to another, you'll know when to use one and when not to use the other, or when to use the other. And the only thing that's going to teach you that is using them a lot and really understanding what they're doing and what they sound like. But that is absolutely one of my go-to, that and decapitator for saturation and distortion.
Fire, fire. Um,
Oddly enough, in this particular mix, I am using one other one here. This actually also happens to be a great saturation and distortion plugin. I use it as probably my third most often saturation or distortion plugin behind those other two. But same company that makes Unisum. This is a great one too.
what was the name of that?
Kelvin, KELVIN.
Awesome. That's dope,
By,
man.
by Tone Projects.
Sue Hassam asks us, at what volume level is the track gain staged? At the master bus before starting to use plugins, or does the volume change while adding plugins?
So that's what the VCAs are all about. And so here's the workflow. You get a session in. Let's say somebody sends you files from Logic, so they're audio files and not a Pro Tools session. So import those in, assign the VCAs based on food groups. I also have what I call an all VCA, which basically is, and I'm going to open up this group window here. So here are all my VCAs: drums, bass, guitar, keys, lead vocal, background vocals. I also have a VCA for effects and parallel processing. However, that is strictly a workflow based on a control surface and no other reason, because I can spill those plugins quickly onto the faders in 2 seconds. All of these other VCAs then get ultimately every track in the session is then routed to one more VCA, which I call all. So all of the drums, all of the basses, all the guitars, all the keys, all the vocals, on top of their food group VCA, also get routed to a VCA that is all. So literally, I have one fader that controls the overall level of every single track hitting the mix bus. So if I start a mix and I'm looking up and I'm starting to build a mix, and I look at my VU meter, which is my first plugin on my master fader, and I notice that, man, I'm as much as I thought I had a pretty good idea of where to start everything level wise, the hottest I'm hitting the mix bus is -3 or -4. So I want to be getting that a little closer to 0, so that I'm not trying to make up more gain on my master fader as opposed to hitting my master fader. So that all VCA, as I'm building my mix, I'm adjusting the overall level of my mix based on constantly looking up, seeing what my gain structure is, seeing how hard I'm hitting my mix bus, and seeing what my ultimate output level is, already going through my compressor and limiter, which are basically set on averages that also have to be paid attention to as you're building the mix, because you can't know definitively exactly what your thresholds are going to be from pushing up a kick drum. So it's something that has to be monitored throughout the course of the mix. Having done this for longer than most of your viewers have been alive, I have a pretty good sense of where things need to start. So I have my basic settings, and I don't do shit tons of compression on my master faders. I a couple dB. So just simply based on experience, I kind of know, based on how many tracks there are, what the genre is, roughly where those levels need to start. And I have those meters and those plugins in front of me the entire session. So I'm constantly monitoring the overall gain structure, making sure it's a healthy level going in without hitting overs, and a healthy level going out without hitting overs. And that should answer the question.
That's great. Great, man. I honestly love the use of all the VCAs, not something very commonly, but
so then the one thing to keep in mind here, as I mentioned, this VCA that's literally all of my effects returns and parallel processing returns. You can't include those in your all, because they're all post fader. So if you were to include those in your all and you change the gain on your all, either adding or subtracting, you're going to be changing the level of those aux returns twice as much as you mean to be, because they're post fader. So they cannot be included in your all. I like having it because, like I said, all I need to do on my console is if I attention that VCA fader, it automatically spills all of the aux tracks onto the rest of my console. So if I need, let's say I have a session that has 200 tracks in it, and I'm looking for a particular reverb that's 130 tracks in, I can simply hit that VCA, tension it, and it spills all those auxes onto my surface, and I can find a track very quickly. So that's the only reason I have an aux, an effects return, and parallel processing VCA. It's not necessary and absolutely cannot be included in your all. This is such a much better route of dealing with gain structure than dealing with food group auxes, where changing that level and chasing your tail between shit tons of plugins on the individual tracks and shit tons of plugins on a food group aux is tail chasing to me. VCAs are a much more efficient way of dealing with gain structure.
Super dope, man. George T113 says, what are the most common elements that you find yourself automating? Do you automate elements like the drums and bass a lot, or more?
You, man. Everything. I mean, you're not going to sit there and constantly ride a snare, especially in a program track, but literally everything else. That's what working a mix is. That's what being a mixer is all about. It's not how to avoid doing rides. It's how to make music out of the tracks that you're given. And music is not static from bar 1 to bar 90. It moves. And that's what being a mixer is all about for me. And riding tracks, I don't care what track it is. You're less likely to ride a snare drum than you are a lead vocal. But take a funk guitar track, it's going to hit. You need to work it. There's sections of that tune where that's going to be more important than other sections, and you've got to make it more important because the guitar player didn't know that when he was playing it. How do you make music out of it? You write it. You make automation moves to make the track dynamic and interesting.
Beautiful.
And how'd you like my singing there?
That was awesome. A great auditory description for us. We have a couple more.
Time for a couple more before I get back to my mix here.
Perfect. I was gonna give us a last call for questions. If anybody in the audience has a final question for him, we got just 3 more right now. Million Hertz asks, what level a bass or 808 track should not rise above, in your opinion?
Well, define level in this question is my.
I'm assuming they're talking about like a decibel number. I know that's not very good because that's variant, but
it unfortunately it's not an accurate question or a legitimate question to even ask, because it's all about balance. It isn't how hot do I make this. I know a bunch of guys that will go in and they're super concerned about, after they add plugins, that the output level after plugins is meeting what is exactly the same, and they're adjusting for. I don't do that either. I'm not hitting overs. I'm not balancing for input constantly equals output, whether regardless of how many plugins are on there. What I care about is I'm not overloading any particular track or distorting any track or hitting overs on any particular track, and I'm not doing it to the mix bus. Short of that, there's not a number that you can say, here's what your bass should be. I don't care for what genre. It's all based on the track and all based on musicality and all based on the balances of the track that you're working in, not hitting overs while you're doing it.
Amazing. To expand on his question a little, do you maybe have like a ballpark in terms of instrumentation that like your bass typically is above this instrument or typically is below this, or it just completely varies?
Totally depends on the track, because if you're talking about a hip hop track and compared to a 3-piece jazz trio that's upright bass, clearly the bass level between those two things are going to be wildly different. Completely and totally depends on the track and the genre.
Absolutely. Fish Jackson asks us, what's a frequency or frequency range that annoys you the most often?
Mid-range, 3K, especially in a vocal. If you're doing this, if you crank it a little bit and you're doing this, it's going to be mid-range, upper mids, probably 3, 4, 5K, somewhere in there, or a honky 1K, something that, yeah. There you go.
Yep.
That was an easy one.
I think that was our last question. I'm gonna give one more opportunity to answer the question, and or to ask questions. And since we're wrapping up here, are you ready to do some giveaways, Craig?
Am I doing them?
We're gonna do them together.
I'll let you do it. I'll sit and watch while you give some. You're giving away some plugins to somebody,
Sure.
and some good ones.
So it looks like we don't have any more questions. That means we're gonna move to our giveaway. For our giveaway, you've been here since the beginning. You're gonna have the answer to this question. It pertains to Craig's life. He mentioned when he was 17, he got hired to remake a song. Who was the artist that he remade the song? I got our clock ticking. Let's see who in the audience is trying to win some baby audio plugins.
Uh-oh.
I don't think that's an answer. It looks like they're questioning. We'll see who was paying attention in the beginning. Nobody gets it here in a minute. We'll give them
An alternate one.
Somebody says Celine Dion.
Celine Dion is half right. She was the one who made a much bigger hit out of this artist track than ever was originally. But
One Shot Mac said Harmon.
very close. Wrong first letter. Short of that, he's right.
He said Eric.
Carmen. I think he gets it. Close
Okay.
enough for jazz.
Perfect. All right. One Shot Mac. Congratulations, man. You won some baby audio plugins.
So now he's got to go to deserve it. He's got to go listen to Celine Dion's version of All by Myself, and then Eric Carmen's original. But I'm never going to let him hear the cover that I did that got me into this. So that one, he's off the hook for that one.
Awesome. Hey, Mac, go ahead and shoot me a DM on the Instagram if you would. It's located right below me here. Everybody make sure you go follow Craig Bauer on Instagram. His is located right beneath him as well. And don't be discouraged if you didn't win, because we got another question. We're going to be giving away this copy here of Mix With Your Ears, Not Your Eyes. You were here in the beginning. You were also paying attention when Craig had mentioned to us he moved from one city to another city, which he bumped into this artist named Kanye West. What city did Craig build his studio in? I didn't even have to start the clock for that one. DC Maybon answered Chicago. We got the rock out. That means we got the right answer. Let's give some cheer. Yeah. So, DC Maybon, One Shot Mac, please make sure that you head over to Instagram and message me so you can collect your free items. I'll get your info. Craig, thank you very much for joining us tonight, man. I'm curious before you go. I have two personal questions for you. Question number one, do you smoke weed? And if so, what is your favorite strain?
I'm about to shock the hell out of you. You ready?
Hit me.
I've never been high in my entire life, ever once.
Wow. That's awesome. Hey, I dig it.
Now, wait, unless we're potentially counting contact highs from endless, I've spent a lot of time, and my longest running client, who I've literally worked with for now going on, I think 29 years, was also the same year I opened, right about the same time Kanye walked through the door. In fact, I posted a track recently of a cover of Blackbird that we did together. So lots of people who have followed me have probably seen or heard that. That's who I'm talking about. This fine gentleman in the nearly 29 years I've known and worked with him has never not been high, literally. So I don't think he can function on a normal level without being high. So the fact that I've literally gone my entire life and career without getting high once, I know it's shocking. It's true.
That's awesome. That's cool though, man, and I respect it.
But
I highly
I'll
encourage.
add this. My wife works for LVMH, for Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, and she is the director of sales for the Midwest for alcohol, champagne, and wines. So no shortage of alcohol around in this house, although I don't drink very much either. But I can't tell you the same thing about having a glass of wine every once in a while.
That's awesome, man. I have one more question for you. My last question is, do you have any hobbies outside of music?
Oh my God, it's pathetic. I don't know how to do anything else. Absolutely nothing else. Look, man, I've spent anywhere from 12 to 18 hours a day of almost every single day of my life since I was 25 in a recording studio. It's pathetic. I need to find some other interests, don't I? Do I have any other hobbies? Well, I can tell you that in the highlight years, the only other thing I've done that I had a great time doing in those same highlight years of probably the Kanye and Lupe years, the Chicago Bulls were winning championships over and over again every single year, and I had Bulls season tickets for most of those. And check this out, one of my closest friends from high school, who I'm still friends with now, worked for the Bulls and then was hired by Michael Jordan to be Michael's personal assistant for many, many, many years. And I've got one last hilarious story if you want to hear it. Michael's office for his charitable foundation and just his general, running life was in a office building literally on Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago, minutes away from where my studio was. And I used to go visit her every once in a while. And one day a week, and I happened to show up on one of these days, it was her job, and there were stacks of boxes from floor to ceiling of Jordan jerseys. And one day a week, she would open those boxes up with her magic marker and sign 1,000,001 jerseys one time a week for years. So if you've got a Michael Jordan signed jersey, don't bet on it.
That's hilarious.
That is a true story. And if she knew I was probably spewing that information right now, I'd probably be in big trouble. So we won't tell
her. We won't tell. Alrighty, Craig.
All right.
Well, listen, man. I do appreciate your time very much. I love everything you're doing. Very thankful we had you on the show today. You continue to innovate and pave the way for young and veteran audio engineers to really learn and continue to expand their skill set. We got to give you a round of applause, doing all the sound effects. Everybody in the comments has been saying thank you so much. We really, really appreciate you, man. And before you go, you want to let everybody know where they can find you, your website, your Instagram, anything like that?
Instagram is Craig Bauer Mixer. Website is www.craigbauer.com. Facebook, same thing. I'm not really on Facebook anymore. Instagram's really the place to be. If you're interested in getting valuable, or what people tell me are valuable mix tips, interspersed with me promoting my own work here and there, go follow me on Instagram.
Amazing. And make sure you hit up Craig for the mix consultation, because Craig gonna get you right.
There's that too. You want to get some personal one-on-one? It ain't free, but it ain't crazy either. And you can send me a mix. I listen to it on my own time. Then we jump on a Zoom call for an hour and we talk about all the shit we just spent an hour talking about. That's
amazing, man. I can tell you, I graduated valedictorian from a recording school, and I did not learn more than sitting beside a veteran engineer and just being able to hear what they hear. And I think
just be thankful you grew up in the time where there's the internet. Sadly, that didn't exist. So everything I learned, I had to learn by myself. There was no sitting next to anybody, and there was no internet.
And that's why you're the GOAT.
I gotta get back to work. So I'm off.
Craig, thank you, man. I hope you
Got it.
have a great evening. I hope to have you again soon on the show. And
Yeah.
we'll talk to you later. All right, buddy?
All right, take it easy, man.
Gang. And if you are here still, make sure next week you tune in for episode 14 of Knowledge That Kills. I want to give a special thank you to Mr. Craig Bauer. I want to give a special thank you to the audience today. I want to give a special thank you to everybody who has subscribed or followed the channel, who's constantly been supporting me. We're growing every single week. We've got another dope interview coming to y'all next Thursday. Make sure you tune in. We have Amon AJ Jackson joining us. AJ Jackson is best known for his work with Future, Young Thug, Rick Ross, Snoop Dogg, and T Grizzly. Oh yeah, you do not want to miss this. So make sure next week you tune in. Make sure you head over to my Instagram, you follow me so you can get all the latest up-to-date info about Knowledge That Kills and all the great things we're doing here. Make sure that you tune in. We got another giveaway coming. We're going to continue to get more sponsors. We're going to continue to give back to the wonderful community helping us do this. And I just want to say thank you one more time to everybody who's here. I'm out of here, y'all. Gone. Have a good night. Peace.